Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of extreme clinical precision.
Right. Yeah, like it's a math equation.
Exactly. It's almost like engineering. You fall off a ladder, you break your arm, and the doctor throws the x-ray up on the light board, and there is that jagged white line. The doctor just points a pen at it and says, there it is, there's your problem.
Yeah, it's completely binary. It's either broken or it's not.
Right. And there is a profound comfort in that, I think. We like things to be visible. We like categories that just don't overlap.
Oh, absolutely.
But then you step out of the physical world and into something like, say, the world of neurodevelopment or trauma, and suddenly that x-ray machine is just useless.
Yeah, it doesn't apply at all.
We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky, it's heavily nuanced, and it's totally dependent on context.
Right.
And I've been thinking about this because that exact same illusion of, clean and simple happens when we look at history.
Oh, for sure. Especially ancient history.
Specifically, yeah, when we look at ancient sacred texts. And for this deep dive, we have this massive corpus of literature in front of us today, which is the parables of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And if you grew up hearing these stories, or even if you just kind of absorbed them through cultural osmosis, you probably picture something very clean.
Yes, very sanitized.
You picture a stained glass window. You imagine a polite, softly lit moral fable told to children in a Sunday school classroom, basically just to teach them how to share.
Yeah, the broader cultural assumption is almost entirely that. It's that these are simple, detached little folktales.
Right.
A guy plants some seeds, or, someone finds a lost coin, someone helps a traveler.
Yeah.
And the takeaway is always presumed to be just, be nice to your neighbor, pay your taxes, and be a good citizen.
But, okay, let's unpack this, because if you actually strip away 2,000 years of polish and ecclesiastical varnish from these sources, you find something incredibly dangerous. The texts we are diving into completely shatter that stained glass window. These stories were not polite.
Not at all.
They were radical, socially dense, heavily politicized narratives. They were engineered to absolutely overturn the human expectations of first-century Jewish Palestine.
Yeah, they were deeply disruptive.
So to me, looking through all of this material we have, the parables feel much less like Aesop's fables and much more like a Trojan horse.
A Trojan horse. I like that. How so? Break down that analogy.
Well, think about the mechanics of a Trojan horse, right? From the outside, it looks unassuming, rather.
Right.
It looks like a gift, or at least something culturally familiar. A parable looks like a simple, everyday story about farming, or fishing, or baking bread.
Exactly. It's a domestic scene.
Yeah. So you let the story into your mind because it feels safe. It lowers your defenses.
Mm-hmm.
But once it gets inside your head, once the gates are closed, it suddenly opens up. And this massive theological and social confrontation just spills out and completely takes over your internal city.
What's fascinating here is that is a remarkably accurate way to describe the psychological function of these texts.
Really?
Yeah, because to understand that confrontation, you really have to look at how these narratives actually operate as a corpus.
Okay.
We aren't looking at a single isolated book you can just pull off a theological shelf. We're looking at a coherent teaching corpus.
Primarily in the Synoptic Gospels, right?
Exactly. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And this corpus has a very specific, almost paradoxical function.
Right.
The parables are designed to simultaneously reveal the kingdom of God and conceal it.
Which is just wild to think about. I mean, a teacher who intentionally tells stories to hide the point from certain people.
It goes against everything we think about modern education. Yeah.
Totally. But before we can get into, how he was concealing it, or even the literary mechanics of the stories themselves, we have to ground this in reality.
Yes, the historical context is everything.
Because if you just read these as spiritual metaphors floating up in the clouds, you completely miss the explosive payload of the Trojan horse. We have to look at the dirt, the taxes, and the crushing social pressure of first-century Galilee.
It is absolutely impossible to separate the parables from the gritty reality of the world they were spoken into.
Right.
We are looking at a very specific historical window, roughly AD 27 to AD 30.
Okay.
And this wasn't some autonomous, free-floating spiritual utopia. This was a physical world existing under strict Roman imperial hegemony.
Right. Rome was in charge.
Completely.
Yeah.
And the region of Galilee, where the vast majority of this teaching took place, was ruled by Herod Antipas.
And he was like a client king, right?
Exactly, a client king for Rome.
Mm.
He answered to the empire, and the empire demanded resources heavily.
And we aren't just guessing about what that world looked like based on the texts alone, which is the cool part. We have incredible archaeological proof.
Oh, tons of it.
Yeah, this isn't mythic geography like Middle-earth. For example, back in 1986, there was a severe drought in Israel. And the waters of the Sea of Galilee receded dramatically. And sticking out of the mud, archaeologists actually found the remains of a first-century fishing boat.
Right, the Jesus boat, as it came to be known colloquially.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating about that discovery isn't that it belonged to Jesus or his disciples, because, I mean, there's zero evidence of that.
Sure, yeah.
But rather, what it tells us about the economic reality of the people he was actually speaking to.
Right, the materials it was made of.
Exactly. The boat was patched together from 14 different types of wood.
14.
14. That speaks to immense grinding poverty. When a plank rotted, the fishermen couldn't afford new cedar or oak.
They just grabbed whatever was lying around.
Exactly. They scavenged whatever scrap wood they could find just to keep the vessel afloat.
Which, if you're listening right now and wondering, why we care about the scrap wood on a buried boat when we're supposed to be talking about theology, it's because it makes the stories real.
It grounds them.
Yeah. When Jesus stands on the shore and talks about fishing, he isn't just pulling a neat poetic metaphor out of thin air. Fishing on the Sea of Galilee was a vital economic engine, but it was modest. And it was heavily, heavily taxed by an agrarian order. Rome took its cut, Herod took his cut, the toll collectors took their cut.
It was relentless.
So to the people listening, that boat wasn't a metaphor. It was their physical exhaustion, it was their livelihood, and it was their unending economic anxiety.
Exactly. Archaeology doesn't authenticate the specific characters in the parables like. It doesn't prove there was a literal prodigal son.
No, obviously not.
But it authenticates the social grammar of the narratives. We have the ruins of first-century synagogues in places like Gamla and Masada.
Wow.
We've unearthed domestic courtyard houses in Capernaum and Sepphoris, where multiple generations live stacked on top of one another.
Just crammed in there?
Crammed in. We've found mikvaot, which are these rituals, stone bathing vessels used for Jewish purity practices.
Right.
All this constructs a deeply physical, deeply anxious world.
And I think the best example of how the physical world changes the meaning of the story is the parable of the Good Samaritan.
Oh, absolutely.
The setup is so simple. A guy is walking from Jerusalem down to Jericho. He gets ambushed by robbers, beaten, and left for dead.
Right.
And if you don't know the geography of that specific region, it just reads like a story about a random mugging. Unfortunate, but, generic.
But if you know the geography, the psychological tension of the story just skyrockets.
Tell us about the road.
The road from Jerusalem to Jericho is a treacherous, arid, steep descent. You drop over 3,000 feet in elevation in just about 18 miles.
That is steep.
Very steep. It's a winding corridor through desolate, rocky terrain, particularly through this area called the Wadi Kelt.
Okay.
And the limestone caves along the route provided perfect cover for bandits.
Yes.
It was absolutely notorious for ambushes.
So it's the ancient equivalent of having to walk alone down a pitch-black, notoriously violent alleyway at 3 a.m.
Yes.
Because it's literally the only way to get home.
Exactly.
When Jesus starts the story by saying, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, the audience would have immediately felt a spike of dread.
They knew exactly what was coming.
Yeah, it's a shocking scenario, but it was a terrifyingly real fear for any traveler at that time.
And that acute physical danger on the road was matched by a chronic economic danger back at home.
Right, the taxes.
The agrarian structure of the time was a massive pressure cooker. You had imperial extraction happening from the top down, with Rome demanding tribute. Then you had local elites, the Herodian dynasty and the aristocratic priesthood, squeezing the peasantry from the middle.
Wow.
So when Jesus tells parables about wealthy landowners leaving the country or tenant farmers staging violent revolts, crippling unpayable debts, arguments over a daily wage.
Wait, let me stop you there.
Sure.
Because this is a massive shift in perspective for a lot of people. When he's talking about a servant who owes 10,000 talents to a king or a landlord who kicks people out, this wasn't just a spiritual metaphor about sin and forgiveness.
No, not at all.
He was pushing on actual raw economic nerves in the community.
He was absolutely pushing on raw nerves. He was using the very present trauma of their daily lives to communicate the reality of the kingdom.
That is so intense.
Think about the debt parables. If you were a peasant farmer in Galilee, a bad crop didn't just mean you tightened your belt for a season.
Right.
It meant you had to borrow money from a wealthy patron at exorbitant interest just to pay your Roman taxes.
Just to survive.
Just to survive.
Yeah.
And if you couldn't pay the patron back, your land was confiscated, and your family was literally on the verge of being sold into debt slavery.
Oh, wow.
That was a real legally enforced possibility under that agrarian structure.
So the stakes were life and death.
Exactly. So when Jesus tells a parable about a king who looks at an unpayable, catastrophic debt and simply absorbs the cost
Yeah.
and completely forgives the debtor, that isn't just a nice thought. That is an explosive, reality-altering concept to that audience.
It's a total powder keg. And I mean, if you have a society under that much intense economic and physical pressure, it's naturally going to form incredibly strict cultural boundaries to protect itself.
Oh, survival depends on it?
You don't survive in a pressure cooker by being loose with the rules. And what's wild to me is how the parables systematically target every single one of those societal boundaries.
This is a crucial layer to unpack.
Hmm.
We really have to look at the social grammar of first-century Mediterranean culture.
Okay.
This wasn't a modern, individualistic Western society where you can just be whoever you want to be.
Right. No, find yourself kind of stuff.
Exactly. The culture was governed by absolute pillars.
Mm-hmm.
Honor and shame, reciprocity, incredibly tight kinship networks, the system of patronage, and severe purity concerns.
Mm-hmm.
Honor was a tangible currency. It was literally more important than wealth.
Wow.
Everything you did was public, and everything you did either added to your family's honor or incurred devastating social shame.
And a great example of this is the banquets and weddings that pop up constantly in the parables.
Yes.
Because today, we think of a wedding as a fun party.
Right.
There's a DJ, an open bar, maybe a bad toast from the best man.
Right.
But in that culture, a wedding wasn't just a party. It encoded your entire public reputation, who you invited, exactly where they sat in relation to the host, and most importantly, who declined your invitation. It was a public ledger of your social standing.
That is the perfect way to phrase it, a public ledger.
Right. If you invited your peers and they made excuses not to come, your social capital was completely bankrupt.
And Jesus uses these exact cultural pillars, the weddings, the banquets, the purity codes, as vehicles for his revelation. And he often does it by turning them completely upside down.
Yeah.
He frequently uses ethnic boundary violations to make his point. If we look back at the Good Samaritan, for instance,
Okay.
the story only works because Samaritans and Jews viewed each other with intense, centuries-old mutual suspicion.
Well, let's break that down a bit, because I think a lot of people just assume Samaritan means like a nice person who helps you change a flat tire.
Right. Because of the Good Samaritan laws we have today.
Exactly. Modern use of the phrase. But back then, it was a deeply offensive term to a Jewish audience, wasn't it?
Deeply offensive. The animosity went back hundreds of years, rooted in the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel.
Okay.
The Samaritans were viewed by first-century Judeans as ethnically compromised half-breeds who worshipped at an illegitimate temple on Mount Gerizim.
So there was real hatred there.
Oh, intense hatred. There were deep historical and religious grievances, including the literal desecration of each other's holy sites. To a first-century Jewish audience, the Samaritan was the ultimate other. They were fundamentally unclean. So, to construct a narrative where the venerated religious elites, the priest and the Levite, fail to uphold the law of love because they are terrified of corpse impurity,
Right.
while the despised Samaritan is the only one who acts with divine compassion. It was profoundly disruptive. It was direct insult to the established social hierarchy.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because it's almost impossible to find a direct modern equivalent to that.
It is hard, yeah.
But it would be like taking the two most politically and violently polarized groups you can think of today, right? And telling a story to one group where the person they inherently distrust and despise is the clear hero of the story.
And their own leaders are the cowards.
Yes. Their own respected leaders are the cowards. You wouldn't just get politely clapped for telling that story today. You'd get run out of town.
Exactly. And the boundary breaking didn't stop at ethnicity. It extended deeply into gender dynamics, which is another area where the parables are surprisingly radical.
Yes, I love this part of the material.
Recent scholarship really points out how intentionally Jesus paired male and female figures in his teaching.
Think about the parable of the lost sheep, right? A shepherd loses one sheep out of 100, leaves the 99 in the open country, and goes out to find the lost one. The shepherd is a male figure, representing God seeking the lost. But right next to it, immediately following, Jesus tells the parable of the lost coin. A woman loses one of her 10 silver coins. She lights a lamp, she sweeps the entire house, and searches carefully until she finds it.
Yes.
And when she does, she calls her friends and neighbors together to rejoice.
He pairs the male shepherd in the agricultural field with the female manager of the domestic household.
Yeah.
And he uses both domains equally to represent the divine action of God searching for humanity.
Which, I mean, for a first-century teacher in a deeply patriarchal society where women's testimony wasn't even considered valid in a court of law, is a striking choice.
Very striking.
To use the female domestic world, literally sweeping a dirt floor in a dark house, as an equally valid, perfectly parallel vehicle for divine revelation as a male shepherd.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, when you synthesize all of this, the dirt-poor fishermen, the brutalized travelers, the humiliated banquet hosts,
Right.
the women sweeping the floors, the widows constantly harassing corrupt judges for basic justice, you realize that none of this is decorative.
It's all intentional.
It is the vocabulary of the kingdom. Jesus isn't just trying to be folksy or relatable. He is making a massive theological claim
What's the claim?
that the kingdom of God is breaking into the ordinary, messy, sweating, lived reality of human beings.
But if you're living in a society where stepping out of line brings immense public shame, or worse, actual Roman retaliation, how do you actually criticize the system without getting killed immediately?
Right, that's the danger.
Because if Jesus had just stood on a soapbox in the market and shouted, "The temple system is corrupt and Rome is an oppressive beast," the Roman guards would have crucified him on Tuesday.
They absolutely would have. It would have been swift.
He needed a literary cloaking device, and that is exactly what the mashal is.
Yes, the mashal is the key to unlocking the parables. It's a Hebrew term, and it encompasses a wide range of figurative speech. As we touched on earlier, parables aren't fables. Fables use talking animals or animated trees to teach a universal moral truth like Aesop's tortoise and the hare.
Right. These don't have talking animals.
Exactly. Parables strictly use human social worlds. But they also aren't simple medieval allegories, where every single tiny detail has a secret one-to-one decoded meaning. They are compressed narrative analogies.
And this wasn't a brand new literary technology that Jesus just invented out of thin air, right? He was pulling from a deep historical tradition.
Very deep. The mashal is rooted heavily in the Old Testament prophetic tradition.
Okay.
It functions as a proverb, a riddle, or sometimes a dark saying. If you trace the redemptive historical line, Jesus' parables are echoing the great prophets.
Like who?
Well, the most famous example is the prophet Nathan confronting King David in 2 Samuel chapter 12.
Oh, right.
David has just committed adultery with Bathsheba and murdered her husband Uriah just to cover it up.
Yeah, bad news.
David is the absolute monarch. You cannot just walk up and accuse him of murder without losing your head. So Nathan uses a mashal.
He tells a story.
He tells David a story about a rich man with massive flocks of sheep who steals a poor man's one beloved pet lamb to feed a guest.
And David, completely blind to the trap, gets absolutely furious at the rich man in the story.
He does.
He slams his fist down and demands the man make restitution. His own sense of justice is activated by the story.
Yes. The Trojan horse is inside the walls.
Oh.
And then Nathan springs the trap. He looks at the king and says, "You are the man."
Chills.
That is prophetic speech. The parable bypasses the ego's defense mechanisms. Or think of Isaiah's vineyard song in Isaiah chapter 5, where God plants a beautiful vineyard, does everything right, but it only produces wild, sour grapes.
And Jesus uses that one too, right?
He directly borrows that exact imagery for his own parables. The power of the mashal lies in juxtaposition. A familiar, everyday scene suddenly twists and becomes an unavoidable theological confrontation.
Let's actually look at the structural blueprint of how these parables operate, because there's a definite formula to this literary cloaking device. It usually follows a 5-step progression, right? First, you have the everyday scene, sowing seed in a field or waiting for a wedding party to arrive. It grounds you in reality.
Exactly.
Second, you have a surprising turn. This is where the story bends.
Right, the twist.
Like a king completely forgiving an unpayable multi-million-dollar debt. or a master paying the guy who worked 1 hour in the field the exact same wage as the guy who sweated for 12 hours.
Third, that surprising turn creates a moral or theological summons. The story demands that the listener process the shock. Fourth, there is a hidden kingdom disclosure. Something about the nature of God's reign or God's character is revealed through that shock.
Okay.
And finally, the fifth step, the listener decision.
Right.
The parables rarely tie everything up with a neat bow. They often end abruptly. The story just hangs in the air, waiting for the audience to react to the confrontation.
Okay, but this brings up the most confusing and honestly frustrating part of this entire deep dive.
Oh, I know where you're going.
The overarching purpose of the parables is said to reveal and conceal. And there is this deeply jarring moment in Mark chapter 4.
Yes.
The disciples ask Jesus why he teaches in parables, and he quotes Isaiah, essentially saying he speaks in parables so that the resistant people will look and see but not perceive, and hear and listen but not understand, so that they may not turn again and be forgiven. Hold on. Why on earth would a teacher whose job is literally to illuminate intentionally try to conceal the truth from his audience? It feels almost cruel.
It is arguably one of the most difficult, tension-filled concepts in the Synoptic Gospels.
Yeah.
To understand it, we have to look at the Greek term used in that passage, mysterion, which translates as mystery or secret.
Okay.
In the theological framework of the text, the parables function as a divine filter.
It's a filter.
Yes. The kingdom of God isn't just a set of intellectual data points to be memorized on a chalkboard. It requires a specific posture of the heart.
Right.
The parables reward the receptive, those who are humble enough to say, I am totally lost, I don't understand, please explain this to me.
Which, tellingly, is exactly what the disciples do in private. They ask for help.
But to the proud, to the religious elites who think they already possess all the answers, who think they have God completely boxed up and figured out, the stories remain impenetrable.
So, to the arrogant scholar, a parable about a farmer throwing seeds on rocks just sounds like a silly, uneducated story about a farmer.
Exactly.
They dismiss it, and in dismissing it, they judge themselves.
Precisely. The parable forces active hearing rather than passive consumption. It deeply honors the listener's agency.
Wow.
If you want to remain hardened in your own self-righteousness, the parable will oblige you. It will allow you to remain hardened.
That is heavy.
But if you have ears to hear, as the recurring phrase goes, the story acts as a key that unlocks the basilia to theou, the kingdom of God.
I'm glad you brought up the Greek there, because looking at the original language explains so much of the mechanism behind how this works.
It really does.
We've got parabole, which literally means a placing beside or throwing things side by side. It's a comparison. Then there's basilia to theou, the kingdom of God, which is the central subject of almost every parable.
We also have the term crisis, which means judgment or separation.
Our word crisis.
Exactly. It's the root of our English word crisis.
Yeah.
In the context of the parables, it points to an impending, unavoidable accountability.
Okay.
And crucially, there is the word metanoia, which is almost always translated in English as repentance.
Right. And I think a lot of people hear repentance and they just think of feeling incredibly guilty.
Yeah, an emotional state.
Like sitting in a dark room feeling bad about yourself. But the mechanism of metanoia is so much more physical than that.
It is entirely more dynamic. It literally means a fundamental change of mind, a paradigm shift.
Yeah.
Think of it like this. Imagine you are hiking and you've been walking aggressively for 10 miles in one direction. Suddenly, you look at the sun, you look at your map, and you realize you have been walking completely the wrong way. The map is upside down.
Oh, no.
Right. Metanoia isn't just sitting down on a rock and feeling guilty about being lost. It is the physical act of turning your entire body around 180 degrees and walking in the new correct direction.
That's such a great visual.
The parables are engineered to provoke that exact kind of jarring realization and subsequent turnaround.
So if Jesus is out in the Galilean countryside dropping these massive social and theological bombs, and it's causing this much unrest and confusion, how did these specific stories actually survive?
That's a great question.
Because he didn't write a book, he was an oral teacher, he spoke them, and then decades later, amidst wars, political upheavals, and the total destruction of Jerusalem, 4 different writers had to figure out how to preserve them for totally different audiences.
That curation process is what gives the Gospels their distinct flavors.
Right.
The academic consensus in our material is clear. The core of the parables is Jesus's authentic oral teaching, delivered around AD 27 to 30.
Okay.
but they were written down and compiled between AD 60 and AD 90. Their canonical form heavily reflects the theological shaping of the evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Mm-hmm.
Each writer arranged, grouped, and framed the material to highlight different facets of the kingdom for the specific crises their communities were facing.
So what does this all mean? The analogy I keep coming back to here is music.
I like this one.
Think of reading the different gospels like listening to different producers remixing the exact same hit track.
Okay, yeah.
The core melody, Jesus's authentic oral teaching, the raw vocals, if you will, is the exact same across the board. But each producer brings out a totally different element of the song based on what the crowd needs to hear.
That's a highly effective way to conceptualize it. Let's start with Mark, for instance.
Okay.
Mark is widely regarded by scholars as the earliest gospel, written before AD 70. If we use your analogy, Mark is the producer who drops a heavy, urgent, almost frantic bass line. His gospel is the shortest, it's incredibly fast-paced, and it heavily emphasizes the hiddenness of the kingdom, the secrecy of Jesus' identity, and the brutal reality of suffering.
Mark is the one who includes the parable of the seed growing secretly, right?
Yes, exactly.
Where the farmer plants the seed, goes to sleep, wakes up, and the seed has sprouted. But the farmer has absolutely no idea how it happened. It's the only parable entirely unique to Mark.
Yes, and it perfectly encapsulates Mark's theology. It highlights that the kingdom's growth is real and the harvest is certain, but the mechanism of its growth is entirely God-driven and largely mysterious to human observation.
Interesting.
It's an encouragement to a community that is likely facing persecution and wondering why God's kingdom isn't more visibly triumphant.
Then you have Matthew. Matthew is writing a bit later, usually dated around AD 70 to 80. Matthew is the highly organized, meticulous synthesizer. He takes the parables and groups them into these massive, structured, thematic blocks.
He loves order.
Right. You get a whole block on the kingdom's arrival in chapter 13, a block on church community in chapter 18, and a massive block on end times judgment in chapters 20 through 25.
Matthew's emphasis is undeniably heavy on judgment, corporate righteousness, and the final apocalyptic separation of the good from the evil.
Yeah.
You see this vividly in the parable of the weeds, where the wheat and the tares grow together until the harvest.
Or the parable of the net. Right.
Exactly, the net that catches all kinds of fish, which are then sorted on the shore. Matthew is intensely concerned with the internal purity of the church community and the reality of eschatological accountability.
Which makes sense when you understand the historical trauma they were processing. The Roman destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 is the dark shadow hanging over Matthew.
It hangs over everything.
But before we get to that, we have to look at Luke. Often dated similarly to Matthew, around AD 70 or slightly later. If Mark is the heavy bass and Matthew is the organized synthesizer, Luke brings this incredibly soulful, acoustic, mercy-focused vibe.
I love that.
He distributes his parables throughout this long, sweeping travel narrative as Jesus journeys toward Jerusalem.
Luke's theological focus is profoundly centered on social reversal. He highlights marginalized outcasts, the prominence of women, the extreme spiritual dangers of wealth, and radical, scandalous divine mercy.
Yeah, his are the famous ones.
It is only in Luke's gospel that we find the masterpieces of grace and reversal. The Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, the rich fool, and the rich man and Lazarus.
Well, wait, what about John? Because if you open the Gospel of John looking for these stories, you're going to be very confused.
You won't find them. John is the outlier of the canonical tradition.
Okay.
The texts date John much later, likely toward the end of the 1st century, and tellingly, John contains absolutely no formal synoptic parables.
None at all.
None. There are no stories about farmers sowing seeds or women sweeping floors for lost coins or kings throwing banquets in John.
So what does he do instead?
Instead, John utilizes rich, extended symbolic and figurative discourses. Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, or I am the true vine, or I am the bread of life.
Oh, the I am statements.
Exactly. It's a completely different literary style, focusing intensely on the eternal identity and origin of Jesus himself, rather than the earthly mechanics of the kingdom.
I want to go back to that historical shadow I mentioned earlier because it's so crucial for understanding the tension in Matthew and Mark.
The destruction of the temple.
Yeah. In AD 70, after a massive Jewish revolt, the Roman legions commanded by Titus besieged Jerusalem. They starved the city, breached the walls, and completely destroyed the Second Temple. They burned it to the ground. It was an apocalyptic, world-ending trauma for the Jewish people. How does that horrific event explain the tone of the parables in those Gospels?
It explains the overarching sense of crisis. If you are a Christian community compiling a gospel in the immediate aftermath of that destruction, the smell of burning limestone practically wafts off the pages. The parables of Jesus that focus on eschatological warning, vigilance, and judgment suddenly resonate with terrifying historical clarity.
Right.
Take the parable of the wicked tenants. A landowner leases a vineyard to tenants. When he sends servants to collect the fruit, the tenants beat and kill them.
Okay.
Finally, he sends his beloved son, thinking they will respect him. But the tenants murder the son to steal the inheritance. What does the landowner do?
He destroys them.
He returns, destroys those miserable tenants, and gives the vineyard to others.
If you are hearing that story after the year 8070 when the temple has just been leveled, that isn't just a metaphor anymore.
No.
It reads as a profound prophetic explanation of the covenant judgment they just witnessed. The urgency when Jesus says, "Keep watch because you do not know the day or the hour," isn't abstract theology, it's survival.
It is the theological framework for making sense of the ashes. Yet, despite these different contextual emphases, whether it's the urgent Mark, the highly structured and judgmental Matthew, or the socially conscious and merciful Luke, a massive, unifying master theme emerges across the entire parabolic corpus.
And what is that?
It is a theme that just completely flips human reality on its head.
And that is kingdom reversal. This is where the Trojan horse really opens up, because human beings naturally operate on systems of upward mobility. We value power accumulation, visible success, dominance, and wealth. We assume bigger is better and stronger is safer.
We still do.
Right. But the parables argue that the kingdom of God operates in the exact opposite direction.
Kingdom reversal is the most dominant theological note in the parables. The metrics of heaven are completely inverted from the metrics of Rome. The small, hidden, and seemingly insignificant thing becomes the largest, most pervasive reality, like the tiny mustard seed that grows into a massive tree.
Or the leaven, right?
Right, the pinch of leaven that works its way through 50 pounds of dough. The thing that is lost, broken, and wandering is the very thing that is rejoiced over, like the lost sheep of the prodigal son.
Wow.
And conversely, the people who appear the most secure, the most wealthy, and the most independent in this life are the ones who face the harshest, most sudden judgment, like the rich fool.
To really grasp how this reversal works, let's look at the mechanics of a few specific parables. Let's start with the foundation.
Yeah.
The programmatic parables, specifically the parable of the sower, which shows up in Mark 4 and Matthew 13.
The sower is the paradigm for all the other parables. A farmer goes out and scatters seed broadcast style across a field. The seed falls on 4 distinct types of soil: the hard-packed path, shallow, rocky ground, soil choked with thorns, and finally, good fertile soil.
And only the good one works.
Only the good soil produces a multiplying crop. Jesus actually provides an explicit interpretation for this one, stating that the seed is the word or the message of the kingdom.
And the brilliant part of this analogy is where the variable lies. The issue is never the seed.
Never.
The farmer isn't throwing out defective, expired seed. The message of the kingdom is potent and alive. The sole variable in the story is the soil, the listener's reception.
Exactly.
The exact same message hits 4 different people and produces 4 radically different outcomes, entirely based on the posture of their heart.
It's Jesus laying down the ground rules for everything else he is going to teach. He is saying, how you listen to what I'm about to say will determine your ultimate destiny.
It's a warning.
Yes, it removes all the blame from the messenger or the message and places the responsibility squarely, heavily on the listener.
Once he establishes that, he leans heavily into parables about stewardship and accountability.
He does.
We see this in the parable of the talents in Matthew 25, or the minas in Luke 19, and the incredibly confusing parable of the unjust steward. If the overarching theme is reversal, what is being reversed when it comes to money and resources?
What is being reversed is the concept of ownership. In the Roman and Jewish world, wealth was almost universally seen as a sign of divine favor, or at the very least, inherent superiority.
Like you earned it because you're favored.
You owned it because you deserved it. Jesus strips that illusion away completely. The parables reveal that wealth, talents, resources, and time are not an identity. They are a trust.
A trust.
You do not own them. You are simply a middle manager, a steward of God's estate.
And there is always a delay in these stories. The master goes away on a long journey.
Yes, the delay is a crucial mechanism. The master is absent, which gives the stewards the illusion of autonomy.
They think they're in charge.
Right. But the reversal hinges on the fact that his return and the subsequent audit of their lives is absolutely certain.
Wow.
The question the parables pose is, what did you do with the time, the money, and the mercy you were temporarily entrusted with? Did you hoard it, or did you leverage it for the master's purposes?
Which flows directly into the parables about community and rejection. And this brings me to a story that I think is one of the most deeply offensive things Jesus ever taught, at least to a modern capitalist sensibility.
I think I know which one you mean.
The parable of the laborers in the vineyard in Matthew 20.
Ah, yes. It is the ultimate clash between human economics and divine grace.
Okay, let's look at it.
Mm.
A landowner goes out at 6 a.m. at dawn and hires workers for his vineyard. They agree on a denarius, which is a standard, fair daily wage for a laborer. Fine.
Standard contract.
Then the landowner goes out again at 9 a.m., 12 p.m., 3 p.m., and even 5 p.m., just one single hour before quitting time at sunset, and hires more people who are standing around unemployed.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the day, the foreman lines them up to pay them. He starts with the guys hired at 5 p.m., and he hands them a full denarius.
A whole day's wage.
A whole day's wage for 1 hour of work.
Mm-hmm.
So naturally, the guys who've been sweating in the sun since 6 a.m. get excited. They do the math. They think, if he paid them a denarius for 1 hour, we are going to get rich. But they step up, and the foreman hands them exactly 1 denarius, and they are furious. And honestly, as a reader, I am completely on their side.
It feels wrong.
I would unionize against this guy. It is inherently unfair.
It violates every fiber of our human concept of fairness, equity, and merit. But that frustration you feel is the exact theological confrontation the parable is designed to provoke.
It's meant to make you mad.
Yes. When the workers complain, the landowner's response is devastating. He says, "Friend, I'm doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Am I allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me, or do you begrudge my generosity?"
Wow.
The master theme here is that grace is not wage justice.
Grace is not wage justice. If you're driving or walking right now, just think about how radical that concept is.
It's paradigm shifting.
Think about how deeply ingrained the meritocracy is in our psychology. How often do we measure our own worth and the worth of the people around us by a strict, unyielding system of deserving?
We do it constantly.
We think, I worked harder, I went to church more, I gave to charity, so God owes me a better life. Or we look at someone struggling and think, they made terrible choices, so they deserve their suffering.
Right.
This parable takes a sledgehammer to that entire worldview. God's kingdom operates on a radical, disruptive, utterly disproportionate generosity that actually makes rule followers angry.
It completely deconstructs religious pride. But this raises an important question.
Okay.
Who has the authority to dictate these new, disruptive rules of reality? If we look at the Christology of the parables, how they reveal the nature and identity of Christ himself, we see something profound. Jesus isn't just dispensing moral advice like a Greek philosopher standing in the agora. He is casting himself as the messianic center of these stories.
He's not just the narrator, he's the main character hiding in plain sight.
Exactly. When he tells a story about a returning king who audits his servants, or a bridegroom arriving at midnight for a wedding banquet, or a good shepherd risking his life to seek lost sheep, or a beloved son who is murdered by wicked tenants, he's talking about himself.
Wow.
He is making an astonishing claim that the kingdom of God isn't just an abstract philosophical idea. It is physically arriving in his actual person, his ministry, and ultimately his death.
That shifts the entire demand of the parables. It's not just a moral summons to do these good things. It's an existential summons to react to me.
Yes, exactly.
And the ultimate terrifying climax of that reaction happens in the parable of the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25.
The great eschatological climax. The Son of Man returns in glory, sits on his throne, and all the nations are gathered before him. He separates humanity the way a shepherd separates sheep from goats. But the criteria for the final judgment is the surprising turn.
Right. He doesn't ask them to recite the Torah. He doesn't give them a theology exam. He looks at the righteous and says, I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick and in prison, and you visited me. And the righteous are genuinely confused. They say, Lord, when did we ever see you starving or in prison?
They don't even realize they did it to him.
Right. And his response is the core of Christian social ethics. Truly, I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me.
It's a complete fusion of high Christology and radical social ethics.
Final judgment isn't based on your proximity to religious power. It's based on tangible, costly mercy shown to the most vulnerable people in society.
The parable declares that you cannot claim allegiance to the king while ignoring the vulnerable, because the king identifies so completely with the vulnerable that to neglect them is to neglect him.
Man, these stories are so multi-layered. They are economic, political, theological, and psychological all at once.
Oh, absolutely.
Which explains why, for 2,000 years, they have sparked intense, sometimes bitter debate over how exactly we are supposed to read them today. We are reading ancient texts in the 21st century, and there are landmines everywhere.
The history of interpretation is indeed fraught. For centuries, the church swung toward extreme, unchecked allegorizing.
What do you mean?
Well, the classic, almost infamous example is St. Augustine's interpretation of the Good Samaritan from the 4th century.
Okay, what did you do?
Augustine completely ignored the historical tension between Jews and Samaritans and turned the story into a coded theological puzzle. He decided that the man who fell among robbers was Adam.
Adam?
Really? Yes, Adam. Jerusalem was the heavenly city of peace, and Jericho was the moon, representing human mortality. The robbers were the devil and his demons.
Oh boy.
The Samaritan, of course, was Jesus. The inn where the man was taken was the church, and the innkeeper was the Apostle Paul.
Wait, really? The Apostle Paul is the innkeeper?
That's what he argued.
I mean, you have to admire the creativity, but that completely neuters the story.
It totally does.
It strips away all the gritty, real-world punch.
Hmm.
If the innkeeper is just a symbol for the Apostle Paul, you don't have to reckon with the actual scandal of a despised ethnic enemy being the moral hero over your own religious leaders.
Exactly. It makes the story safe. The texts we're relying on argue that a prudent reading must avoid that kind of wild over-allegorizing where every single detail is a secret theological code.
Right.
But it also warns against the opposite extreme,
Yeah.
reducing the parables to simple, one-point moral platitudes. Be nice to people. That flattens them. They are dynamic narratives meant to provoke.
Another massive interpretive minefield is historicity. People get really hung up on asking, did the Good Samaritan actually happen? Was there a real guy who got beaten up on that specific Tuesday?
Right.
Or did a real prodigal son actually run away to a distant country?
The historical reality of the specific characters is entirely secondary. Yes. The Good Samaritan functions as a crafted story. Whether Jesus based it on a local news event that everyone had heard about, or whether it was entirely generated from his imagination, completely misses the point.
Okay.
The point isn't historical journalism. The point is the theological and moral confrontation it creates in the hearer.
And that confrontation is exactly why these 2,000-year-old stories are still uncannily modern. We have better technology, we have smartphones and airplanes, but our internal human wiring, it hasn't changed a bit.
We're the same people.
We are still deeply driven by status-seeking, economic insecurity, intense tribalism, and a deep resentment at the idea of unmerited grace.
If you connect the Good Samaritan to modern polarized cultures, the challenge is immediate.
Oh, yeah.
We live in an era of intense, hypervigilant tribalism, whether it's political, social, or national. The parable cuts through the noise and asks a direct question. Who is the Samaritan in your life? Who is the specific demographic or person whose very identity makes you inherently suspicious or contemptuous?
Yeah.
Now, what if that person is the one who actually models the heart of God while your preferred, trusted leaders walk right past the suffering?
That is a deeply uncomfortable, highly relevant question for today.
It really is.
Or look at how the rich fool connects to modern consumerism. This guy has a massive bumper crop, so much that his current barns can't hold it. So he tears down his barns, builds bigger ones, and says to his soul, "Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry."
He's set for life.
He thinks he has achieved ultimate security. But that very night, God says to him, "Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?"
Yeah.
We are surrounded by an entire trillion-dollar industry built on the exact same illusion, that you can secure your existence through wealth accumulation.
It's the modern dream.
Right. But the parable cuts right through our 401ks, our real estate portfolios, and our retirement anxieties and says, wealth without a posture of dependence on God is existential folly.
And we see the painful, universal experience of family fracture perfectly mirrored in the prodigal son.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
A younger son demands his inheritance early, which in that culture was essentially wishing his father were dead. squanders it in reckless living, hits absolute rock bottom, and returns in deep shame.
Mm-hmm.
The father, shockingly, abandons his patriarchal dignity, runs to the boy, and throws a massive party. But the older brother, who stayed home and obeyed all the rules, is seething with resentment. He refuses to go into the welcome party.
The older brother is furious because of the wage justice thing again.
Yes.
He says, I've slaved for you for years, and you never threw me a party.
Precisely. The parable exposes both the destructive rebellion of the irreligious younger brother and the cold, judgmental, unforgiving pride of the religious older brother.
It gets everybody.
It speaks to any family that has ever experienced estrangement, addiction, and the difficult, scandalous, almost offensive nature of unconditional forgiveness.
But I have to push back on one thing before we close, because it's the elephant in the room.
Okay, let's hear it.
Some of these parables end on a really harsh, terrifying note. In the parable of the talents, the guy who hides his master's money in the ground out of fear isn't just fired.
No, he's not.
He is cast into the outer darkness where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. The parable of the 10 virgins ends with the door to the wedding banquet being locked, and when the foolish virgins knock, the bridegroom says, "Truly, I say to you, I do not know you." Are we meant to read these as purely judgmental? Doesn't that harshness conflict with the overarching message that God is love?
It's a tension you cannot resolve by simply editing out the uncomfortable parts.
Fair enough.
The harshness is an essential structural part of Jesus' teaching ministry. It functions as an eschatological warning. The parables occupy what theologians call the inaugurated kingdom stage of redemptive history.
Okay, meaning what?
Meaning the kingdom has arrived, but it is not yet fully consummated. Therefore, the parables promise immense, present grace like the Father running to embrace the prodigal son.
Right.
But they also guarantee future harvest, accountability, and separation. The invitation to the banquet is wide open right now, but the parables warn that the door will eventually shut.
Delay is not denial.
Exactly. Delay is not denial. The audit is coming.
The urgency is real. It demands a reaction. Which brings us to the end of our deep dive today. Let's pull all these threads together.
Let's do it.
The parables of Christ are historically grounded in the dust, the sweat, and the oppressive taxes of first-century Galilee. They are incredibly sophisticated literarily, utilizing the prophetic mashal tradition to bypass our psychological defenses. And they are theologically explosive. They announce that God's kingdom has finally arrived on earth, but it is operating entirely on its own terms, demanding radical mercy, deep humility, and a complete reevaluation of how we steward our lives.
They absolutely refuse to let the listener remain a passive, comfortable observer.
That's the Trojan horse. If you are listening to this, whether you've been in a church your whole life or you're just fascinated by ancient literature, these stories demand a decision from you.
They do.
They aren't meant to just be nodded at on a Sunday morning and forgotten by your Monday commute. They are engineered to confront your own pride, to question how you use your money, to challenge how you treat the outsiders you despise, and to see how you respond to the scandalous, unfair grace of God.
And as we close, I want to return to that uncomfortable concept of hearing versus hardening.
Right.
If these parables were originally designed as a filter to conceal the truth from those who are arrogant or unyielding in their own righteousness, what modern certainties or fiercely held cultural opinions might we be completely blind to today simply because our own hearts are too hardened to hear the underlying challenge?